Elijah Monroe sat in the 42nd floor conference room of Meridian Aviation Systems, his hands resting flat on mahogany that cost more than most people earned in a year. The August heat outside pressed against floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Dayton, distorting the view of the great Miami River below. Inside, the air conditioning hummed at a temperature cold enough to preserve both contracts and cruelty. Vivian Ashford occupied the head of the table, her posture immaculate in a charcoal Dior suit that represented 3 months of what Eli used to make as a test pilot. To her right, Adrienne Cole shuffled divorce papers with the efficient boredom of an attorney who had dismantled stronger men than the one sitting across from her. To Vivian's left, Grayson Pemberton leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, the hint of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. 38 years old, hedge fund manager, board advisor to Meridian, and the man who had been sleeping with Eli's wife for the past 8 months. Eli had known for 7. Vivian's manicured fingers drummed once against the table, a nervous gesture she probably didn't realize she still had from their early days together when decisions actually mattered to her. "You understand what you're signing, Elijah? You're walking away with nothing. No claim to the house, no division of assets, no alimony." Eli looked down at the papers. 23 pages of legal language that boiled down to a simple truth. He had failed at the one thing that mattered more than engineering, more than 20 years of military service, more than the decade he'd given to building Meridian into a defense contractor that mattered. He had failed to see the woman he married for who she actually was. "I understand." He wore a Carhartt work jacket over a clean flannel shirt, Red Wing boots that had seen 12 years of hangar floors and tarmac. His hands, scarred from a career of prototyping and testing, looked out of place against the expensive paper. But they were steady. Adrian slid a Mont Blanc pen across the table. "Initial here, here, and here. Full signature on page 23. The hallway outside held a figure neither Eli nor Vivian noticed. Zara Monroe pressed her back against the wall, 17 years old and trembling, her MIT acceptance letter folded in the front pocket of her backpack. She had come to surprise her father with the news, to show him that all his sacrifices had meant something. Instead, she watched through the slim gap in the doorway as he signed away their home, their savings, the future he had built brick by brick after her mother died 14 years ago. The pen scratched across paper. 3 initials, 1 signature. Vivian's expression shifted, confusion bleeding through the mask of control. She had expected resistance. She had prepared for Eli to fight, to demand his share of the company he had helped transform, to leverage his position as the chief engineer who had designed the breakthrough that was about to make Meridian Aviation a top-tier defense contractor. The Eclipse propulsion system represented 4 years of work that would secure a multi-billion-dollar Air Force contract. Instead, he capped the pen and placed it back on the table. "Is that all?" Grayson's smirk widened. "Back to the hangar, Monroe. Maybe Southwest needs someone to check landing gear. I hear they're always hiring." Eli stood. The chair didn't scrape. He had learned silence in the Air Force, during 2 decades of service that had taken him from Lackland to Al Udeid and back to civilian life with a chest full of commendations and a skill set that translated to exactly one thing: making aircraft engines that didn't fail at 40,000 feet. He turned toward the door, then paused. "Good luck with the Air Force contract. I hope the fuel efficiency tests go well." The room froze. Vivian's fingers stopped drumming. Adrian looked up from her documents. Grayson's smirk evaporated. "How do you know about the Air Force contract?" But Eli was already walking, his boots silent on the carpet, past the receptionist who had known him for a decade, past the framed photographs of aircraft he had helped engineer, past his daughter who stepped into a doorway before he could see her tears. The elevator doors closed on a man who had given everything and received nothing except the one thing Vivian hadn't thought to take: the truth. 12 years earlier, Elijah Monroe had been a different kind of silent. Not the silence of a man walking away from a marriage, but the silence of a widower who woke at 3 in the morning to check if his 5-year-old daughter was still breathing. Cancer had taken Rebecca on a Tuesday in April, and for months afterward, Eli had lived in a world where every sound was too loud and every silence was the prelude to discovering Zara had stopped existing too. Work became the only language he could speak. Hangar 7 at Edwards Air Force Base smelled like jet fuel and possibility. The SR-89 Raptor sat on the test stand, a turbofan engine that Eli and his team had spent 3 years developing for the F-22 program. The breakthrough was in the blade geometry, a modification so subtle that most engineers had dismissed it as inconsequential. But Eli had run the computational fluid dynamics models 812 times, adjusting angles by fractions of a degree until he found the sweet spot. 19% fuel efficiency improvement over the current generation engines powering frontline aircraft. The test observer, a lieutenant colonel whose name Eli had forgotten in the years since, stood beside the control station. "You sure about this, Monroe? If those blades shatter at high RPM, we're looking at $1 million scrap heap and a safety investigation that'll bury your career." Eli's fingers moved across the keyboard, finalizing test parameters. "The math works, sir. I verified it 400 times. Math doesn't fly planes." "No, sir, but it keeps them in the air." The engine spooled up, the whine building from a whisper to a roar that rattled the hangar walls. Turbine speed climbed, 5,000 RPM, 10,000, 15,000. The blades blurred into a silver disc spinning fast enough to generate thrust that could push an F-22 past the speed of sound. Fuel flow meters tracked consumption in real time, numbers scrolling across monitors that Eli had memorized before the test even began. At maximum thrust, the efficiency gain hit 19.2%. The lieutenant colonel whistled. "Jesus, Monroe, you just saved the taxpayers $3 billion over the next decade." But Eli was staring at the temperature readings, at the vibration sensors, at the pressure differential across the combustion chamber. The numbers told a story that went beyond money. Longer range meant rescue missions could reach farther into hostile territory. Better efficiency meant cargo planes could carry more supplies to troops downrange. Quieter operation meant pilots had a better chance of surviving in contested airspace where radar signatures meant the difference between mission success and a flag-draped coffin. This wasn't about contracts or quarterly earnings. This was about bringing people home. Vivian Sterling, as she was known then, had watched the test from the observation deck. She was 32, the newly appointed vice president of engineering at Meridian Aviation, a woman who had clawed her way up through a defense industry that still treated female executives like diversity checkbox exercises. Her father had founded Meridian 3 decades earlier, but she had transformed it from a regional parts supplier into a company bidding on prime contracts worth hundreds of millions. She found Eli in the break room 2 hours later drinking coffee that had been sitting on the burner since 0600. "Who designed the blade modifications?" "Me and my team, ma'am. Took 3 years to get it right." Vivian sat down across from him. She wore slacks and a blouse that were professional without being severe, and her eyes carried the kind of intelligence that made Eli forget how to breathe for a moment. "It's brilliant. You're brilliant. I just followed the math. The math doesn't follow itself. You saw something no one else did." She leaned forward and Eli caught the scent of her perfume, something expensive and subtle that Rebecca had never worn, because nurses' salaries didn't stretch that far. "Have dinner with me. I want to understand how you think." Eli had learned caution in the years since Rebecca died, Women approached him sometimes, drawn to the quiet intensity he wore like a uniform. But they left when they realized he came with a 5-year-old daughter and a heart that was still learning to beat in a world without the woman who had been his center of gravity. "I appreciate it, ma'am, but I'm not really the dinner type. I've got a daughter at home and I work 60-hour weeks. So bring her. We'll make it an early dinner. Pizza, something a kid would like." Vivian's smile was genuine then, untainted by the ambition that would later corrode everything it touched. "I don't bite, Elijah. I just like men who build things instead of managing them. There aren't many of us left in this industry." The courtship happened in increments. Dinner became dinners. Zara, wary at first, softened when Vivian showed up to her first-grade science fair and asked questions about the baking soda volcano that were actually thoughtful. Eli found himself talking about Rebecca without the crushing weight of grief, about the way she had believed in his engineering even when he was designing parts for regional carriers that nobody had heard of. Vivian listened. She asked questions. She seemed to understand that some silences were sacred. 2 years of dating felt like enough time to know someone. Eli proposed at Edwards in the same hangar where they had first met, kneeling beside the SR-89 engine that had started everything. The ring was simple because it was all he could afford on a test pilot's salary, even with his engineering work on the side. Vivian said yes with tears in her eyes that looked real enough to trust. The wedding was small, held at the VFW Hall in Dayton on a Saturday in October. Zara served as maid of honor in a dress she had picked out herself, 7 years old and believing that maybe her father deserved to be happy again. Eli's Air Force buddies showed up in their dress blues, men who had deployed with him to the Middle East, who had watched him grieve and now watched him try to live again. Vivian's side of the hall held business associates and board members from Meridian, people who shook Eli's hand, with the polite distance of those who couldn't understand why their vice president was marrying a man who still drove a 15-year-old Ford F-150 with rust spreading along the wheel wells. The prenuptial agreement came up 3 weeks before the ceremony. Vivian's attorney had drafted it, a document that was precise in its brutality. All assets acquired before the marriage remained separate. All intellectual property created during the marriage belongs to Meridian Aviation Systems, given that Elijah would be an employee. In the event of divorce, there would be no alimony, no division of marital assets, no claim to stock options or executive compensation. Eli read it once, sitting at Vivian's kitchen table while she poured wine he didn't drink. "You want me to sign this?" Vivian's voice was gentle, the kind of gentle that sounds like reason. "It protects what I've built. You understand that, don't you? My father left me this company. I need to make sure it stays in the family." "I'm about to be family. You know what I mean." She sat down beside him, her hand covering his. "It's just a formality. We're not going to get divorced, but the board requires it. They won't approve our marriage otherwise. They see you as a potential liability, someone who could claim ownership of company assets down the line." Eli looked at Zara, who was watching from the kitchen doorway, her face a mixture of hope and fear that she was about to lose another parent. He signed without reading the rest. It was the second worst decision of his life. The first was trusting that Vivian had married him for reasons that had nothing to do with the engine designs locked inside his head. The first 3 years were good. Eli continued designing, his reputation growing beyond Meridian to the wider defense community. Test pilots requested him specifically for prototype evaluation, because he understood not just the engineering but the human element. What it felt like to trust your life to mathematics at speeds where mistakes meant death. Vivian became CEO when her father retired at 68, and the promotion came with longer hours, late-night calls, Weekends spent in Washington lobbying for contracts. Eli compensated by being present for Zara, showing up to parent-teacher conferences and volleyball games, making sure that at least one parent remembered she existed. The cracks appeared in year 4. Vivian stopped asking about his work. She stopped listening when he talked about the new project, the Eclipse propulsion system that was going to revolutionize military transport aviation. She started talking about him in the third person, even when he was in the room. My chief engineer thinks we can cut fuel consumption by 30%. My team is developing a lighter composite housing. My company is positioning for the Air Force's next generation contract. Never his name, never his contribution, just her possessive pronouns claiming ownership of everything he created. The engine that would destroy their marriage and save his integrity was designated Eclipse 7. Eli had started the design in year 3 of their marriage, working late nights after Zara went to bed, filling notebooks with calculations that built on everything he had learned from the SR-89 Raptor and a dozen other projects that had come before. The breakthrough was a combination of factors. Optimized blade geometry that reduced parasitic drag, an improved combustion chamber that maximized fuel burn efficiency, a composite housing that cut weight without sacrificing structural integrity. 18% lighter, 30% more efficient, 52% quieter. The Air Force was developing a new stealth transport, an aircraft designed to insert special operations teams deep into hostile territory without detection. They needed an engine that was powerful, efficient, and whisper quiet. Eclipse was the answer. Vivian recognized it before Eli finished the first prototype. She started inviting him to board meetings, asking him to present to investors, parading him in front of Air Force procurement officers like evidence that Meridian had the engineering talent to deliver on impossible promises. Eli hated the attention, but he endured it because the engine was bigger than his discomfort. If Eclipse worked, soldiers would come home. Missions would succeed, lives would be saved. That was worth a few hours of corporate theater. General Robert Harding entered the picture in year 4, brought on as a board advisor after his retirement from active duty. He had spent 35 years in the Air Force, the last decade in positions that interfaced with defense contractors. His contact list was worth more than his salary, and his endorsement could fast-track procurement approvals that usually took years. Vivian introduced him to Eli at a company reception, the kind of event where executives networked and engineers stood awkwardly by the bar nursing ginger ale. "General, this is my husband, Elijah Monroe. He's the lead engineer on Eclipse." Harding's handshake was firm, his smile practiced. "I've heard good things, Monroe. The Air Force is watching this project closely." "Thank you, sir. We're doing everything we can to meet the specifications. Just make sure you do. A lot of people are counting on you." The general's attention shifted back to Vivian, and Eli recognized the look. He had seen it before, the way men assessed Vivian not as a CEO, but as a woman they wanted to conquer. Usually Vivian shut it down with the kind of cold precision that made flag officers apologize. This time she didn't. Eli discovered it on a Thursday in November, coming home early from the hangar because Zara had a stomach bug, and the school needed someone to pick her up. He stood in the upstairs hallway of their house, his hand on the doorknob to Zara's room where she was sleeping off the fever, and heard his wife's voice drifting up from the home office below. She was on a conference call, speakerphone, and apparently thought the house was empty. A male voice, smooth and confident. "When he files the patent for Eclipse, use your name as co-inventor." Vivian's voice carried hesitation buried deep but not quite dead. "Why? Elijah designed it. Every calculation, every test, every refinement, it's his work. The Air Force trusts generals and CEOs, not mechanics with engineering degrees from state schools. And I'll make sure procurement fast-tracks the approval if my name is on the patent alongside yours." Silence stretched long enough that Eli thought maybe she would say no. Maybe the woman he married still existed somewhere beneath the ambition. "You want this contract or not?" "Of course I want it. Meridian needs it." "Then you need me on that patent, and you need to get rid of the engineer. File for divorce after the patent goes through." "He gets nothing. We get everything. That prenup you had him sign means all intellectual property belongs to Meridian, which means it belongs to you." More silence. Then Vivian's voice, quieter but clear. "What about Zara? What about her? She's 17, almost an adult. Kids survive divorce. It's not like you're taking her father away completely. He'll still get visitation or whatever the court orders." The conversation continued, mapping out a betrayal so calculated that Eli stood frozen in the hallway, unable to process the enormity of what he was hearing. His wife of 4 years and the board advisor she'd been sleeping with were planning to steal his life's work, divorce him with nothing, and justify it as business strategy. He didn't confront Vivian. He didn't rage or threaten or demand explanations. Instead, he went to Zara's room, sat beside her bed until she woke up, and made her soup while his mind cataloged every conversation, every document, every piece of evidence he would need when the time came. That night, Eli set up a camera in the hangar workshop, ostensibly for safety documentation, but positioned to capture him working alone on the calculations that Vivian would later claim as her own. He started recording conversations using an app on his phone that Vivian never thought to check. He compiled notebooks, 9 volumes of handwritten calculations that showed the evolution of Eclipse, from concept to completion. Every page dated and signed. He created a paper trail so thorough that no attorney, no matter how skilled, could argue it away. And when Vivian filed for divorce in June, 8 months after Eli had discovered the affair and the plan, he acted surprised. He hired no attorney. He made no demands. He signed the papers she put in front of him, papers that stripped him of the house they had shared, the savings account he had contributed to, the car he had bought before they married. He took nothing except his F-150, his tools, and the boxes of documentation that he had labeled as old engineering files, and moved to a storage unit in Fairborn, Ohio, where Vivian would never think to look. She thought she had won. She had no idea the game had changed. The storage unit sat behind a BP gas station on Dayton Yellow Springs Road, one of those facilities that rented 10 by 10 spaces to people accumulating the overflow of American life. Eli's unit contained boxes of engineering files, old furniture from the house he'd lost, Rebecca's belongings that he hadn't been able to donate yet. Everything organized with engineer's precision, each box labeled with dates and project names. He went there the day after signing the divorce papers, after taking Zara home to the 2-bedroom apartment in Fairborn that was all he could afford now. She had retreated to her room without speaking, the MIT letter still in her backpack like a dream that was slipping away at $60,000 per year. Eli found the boxes marked Eclipse primary documentation and pulled out his phone. The call connected on the second ring. "Langford and Associates, how may I direct your call?" "Tobias Langford, please. Tell him it's Elijah Monroe." A pause, then hold music that sounded like it was piped in from a hotel lobby somewhere. Then a voice Eli hadn't heard in 6 years, not since they'd both been colonels finishing up their final deployments before retirement. "Eli, that really you?" "Hey, Toby. Yeah, it's me. Heard you got married to some CEO. Heard it ended. You okay?" "I'm thinking." Tobias Langford had left the Air Force 2 years before Eli, gone straight to law school at Georgetown, specialized in aviation patent law and intellectual property disputes. He'd built a practice representing engineers and inventors in fights against corporations that tried to claim ownership of work they didn't do. "What are you thinking about exactly?" Eli looked at the boxes, at 9 volumes of calculations and 4 years of his life reduced to cardboard and packing tape. "I need you to look at some files. Can you meet me tomorrow?" "Where?" "Fairborn. I'll text you the address." Tobias showed up at 10 the next morning, driving a Tesla that looked out of place in the storage facility parking lot. He was 58 now, his hair more gray than black, but his handshake was still firm and his eyes still carried the sharpness of someone who missed nothing. Eli opened the unit and gestured to the boxes. "Everything's here. 9 design notebooks, video documentation, test reports, communications showing Vivian asking me to explain concepts she later claimed to understand. Financial records showing I bought 73% of Meridian stock over the past 10 years through a shell company nobody knows about." Tobias stopped walking. "Say that last part again?" "Redtail Holdings, LLC. Established 10 years ago, 6 months before I married Vivian. Every patent royalty, every bonus, every dollar I made went into buying Meridian stock through the shell company. Current ownership, 73%. Vivian thinks she controls the company. I actually do." Tobias pulled out a box and started reading. Then another. Then he sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit and went through all 31 boxes over the next 4 hours, making notes on a legal pad that filled up page after page. When he finally looked up, his expression was equal parts amazement and concern. "You've been planning this." "No, I've been protecting this. There's a difference. Eli, this is nuclear. If you execute this correctly, Vivian loses everything. The company, her reputation, possibly her freedom if that patent fraud is prosecutable. Are you sure?" Eli thought about Zara crying herself to sleep last night, about the MIT letter that represented dreams dying because her father had trusted the wrong person, about 4 years of marriage where he'd been erased a little more each day until he was invisible even when standing in the same room. "I gave her 4 years and $425,000. I gave her my work, my reputation, and a partnership I thought meant something. She gave me divorce papers and a plan to steal everything I built. So yeah, Toby, I'm sure." Tobias stood, brushing dust off his pants. "Then let's make sure we do this right. I'll need 10 days to file everything, coordinate with the USPTO, get the evidence organized for maximum impact. Can you wait 10 days? I've waited 8 months since I found out. 10 more days won't kill me." They shook hands, and Eli locked the storage unit behind them. 10 days until Vivian Ashford learned that silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. The Meridian Aviation Systems complex occupied 87 acres on the northern edge of Dayton, a collection of hangars and office buildings that represented 3 generations of manufacturing excellence. Vivian's father had founded the company in 1978. Building parts for commercial aviation at a time when Dayton was still trying to reclaim its legacy as the birthplace of flight. By the time Vivian took over 5 years ago, Meridian had pivoted to defense contracts, specializing in propulsion systems and avionics that kept military aircraft operational in hostile environments. Revenue had grown to $480 million annually under her leadership. Respectable but not dominant. The company employed 390 people, most of them engineers and machinists who had spent their entire careers in the Miami Valley. Vivian had transformed the culture, bringing in MBA-trained managers and consultants who talked about synergies and vertical integration, pushing out the old guard who remembered when the company Christmas party was held in someone's backyard instead of a downtown hotel ballroom. Eli had survived the purges because his engines worked. Vivian needed him, at least until Eclipse was complete and the Air Force contract secured. Now, 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized, She was preparing to erase him from the story entirely. The patent application sat on her desk, black text on white paper that represented the culmination of Eli's career. United States Patent Application Number 1, 2-247-893. Title: Advanced Turbofan Engine with Optimized Blade Geometry and Composite Housing. Inventors: Vivian Ashford, Grayson Pemberton. Elijah Monroe's name appeared nowhere. Adrienne Cole reviewed the document in Vivian's office, her reading glasses perched on her nose in that way lawyers had of looking both scholarly and predatory. "You're certain about this? If he challenges it, we'll have to prove you contributed to the design." Vivian's office overlooked Hangar 3, where technicians were assembling the Eclipse prototype for final testing before Air Force evaluation. Through the window, she could see the engine taking shape, a sculpture of titanium and composite materials that would either secure Meridian's future or bankrupt the company trying. "The prenup is clear. All intellectual property created during the marriage belongs to Meridian. I own Meridian, therefore I own the design. He has no legal claim." "That's not what I asked." Vivian turned from the window, her expression hardening into the mask she wore for board meetings and investor calls. "Elijah worked for me. I directed the project, I secured the funding, I negotiated the Air Force contract. Yes, he did the mathematics, but engineers do mathematics. That's what we pay them for." "And Grayson?" "Grayson brings credibility. The Air Force trusts him. His endorsement will fast-track procurement, cut months off the approval timeline. Adding his name to the patent is strategic. It's also fraud if he didn't actually contribute to the invention." Vivian's smile carried no warmth. "He contributed strategic guidance. Operational requirements derived from his decades of military experience inform the design specifications. That counts as inventorship under collaborative framework doctrine." The patent was filed on a Wednesday morning. By Friday afternoon, the Air Force had scheduled a preliminary technical review. By Monday, Grayson was on a conference call with procurement officers, explaining how his understanding of special operations requirements had shaped Eclipse's development, how his experience in contested environments had guided the acoustic signature priorities. The lie was polished smooth, rehearsed until it sounded like truth. Eli found out through an email that wasn't meant for him, a message forwarded by mistake from one of the junior engineers who still respected the man who had mentored him through his first turbofan design. The subject line was simple: patent filing confirmation. He read it in his apartment, a 2-bedroom unit in a complex near downtown Fairborn where rent was $850 a month, and the neighbors argued loudly enough at 2 in the morning that sleep became theoretical. Zara was at volleyball practice, giving him 90 minutes to absorb the magnitude of Vivian's betrayal before he had to put on the mask of a father who had everything under control. The apartment was furnished with second-hand pieces from Goodwill and the VFW Donation Center. A couch that sagged in the middle, a kitchen table with mismatched chairs. The F-150 sat in the parking lot below, burning oil at a rate that suggested a rebuild was 6 months overdue. His bank account held $8,500. The remnants of savings that had been gutted to pay for Zara's SAT prep courses and college application fees. The MIT acceptance letter sat on the kitchen counter beside a stack of bills he couldn't pay. Cost of attendance, $79,000 per year. Financial aid offered, $19,000 gap, $60,000 multiplied by 4 years, equaling a number that might as well have been 2 million. The patent listed Vivian and Grayson as inventors. The patent that represented 4 years of Eli's life. 600 nights staying late at the hangar. 9 volumes of calculations done in longhand, because sometimes the human brain needed to feel the mathematics, not just compute it. The patent that was supposed to save lives, that was supposed to mean something beyond quarterly earnings and stock prices. They had stolen it. But they had made a mistake. They thought Eli would stay silent because he always had. They thought silence meant acceptance. They were about to learn the difference. Tobias called that evening, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of an attorney who had just seen evidence that changed everything. Eli, I just got the alert. They filed. Vivian and Grayson, co-inventors on Eclipse. Your name isn't anywhere in the application. I know. We need to file a challenge with the USPTO immediately. Federal patent fraud if we can prove it, which we can because you documented everything. But there's a window. We have 60 days from filing to formally object before the patent examiner makes a preliminary determination. Eli looked at the email on his screen, at the names that weren't his. How long to prepare the challenge? 3 days if we move fast. I'll need you to bring all the documentation to my office tomorrow morning. We'll compile the evidence, draft the complaint, coordinate with the Air Force Contracting Office because this impacts a defense procurement. This is going to get loud, Eli. Are you ready? I've been ready for 8 months. The next morning, Eli loaded 31 boxes into the F-150's bed and drove to Columbus, where Tobias's firm occupied the 8th floor of a converted historic building overlooking the Scioto River. The office was everything Eli wasn't: polished, expensive, designed to intimidate opposing counsel with its view and its art collection and its conference rooms that could seat 20. Tobias met him in the parking garage, bringing a paralegal and an associate attorney to help carry boxes. They spent the next 6 hours spreading documentation across the largest conference room, organizing evidence into categories that would become the foundation of their case. 9 design notebooks, every page dated and signed, some with witness signatures from other engineers who had observed Eli working. 147 test reports bearing Eli's signature as principal investigator, not a single one signed by Vivian or Grayson. 300 hours of video footage showing Eli alone in the hangar, deriving equations on whiteboards while explaining concepts to a camera that Vivian had installed for training purposes, without realizing she was creating evidence of her own fraud. Financial records showing Redtail Holdings, LLC, purchasing Meridian stock systematically over 10 years. Acquisition documents filed with the SEC that nobody had bothered to trace back to Eli because the shell company structure was designed for exactly that kind of opacity. Trust documents showing the house Vivian thought she'd kept in the divorce was actually owned by a trust established 8 years ago with Eli as sole beneficiary. The property never actually marital despite them living there together. Communications. Emails where Vivian asked Eli to explain concepts she would later claim to understand. Text messages where Grayson acknowledged knowing nothing about engine design but wanting his name attached for credibility. Recorded phone calls from after Eli had discovered the affair. Conversations he'd captured knowing they would matter eventually. Tobias reviewed it all with the methodical intensity of a lawyer who understood he was building not just a case but a weapon. This is the most thorough documentation I've ever seen in an IP dispute. Most inventors keep notebooks, maybe some test data. You have everything: video, financial records, communications showing they knew they were committing fraud. Eli, where did you learn to do this? 20 years in the Air Force. Combat missions require documentation. Equipment failures require investigation. People die when you don't keep accurate records. I applied the same principle. The associate attorney, a woman named Jennifer who specialized in patent law, looked up from the notebook she was reviewing. Equation 52 here, the pressure distribution calculation. This is the core of the blade geometry optimization, correct? Yes, that's the equation that makes Eclipse work. Get that wrong and the whole engine fails. Can you derive this from memory? Right now. at a whiteboard. Eli walked to the whiteboard mounted on the conference room wall and picked up a marker. 5 minutes later, the board was filled with mathematics, each step flowing naturally from the previous one, no hesitation or reference to notes required. Jennifer photographed the board with her phone. This is going to matter. At the USPTO hearing, they'll ask Vivian to explain her invention. She won't be able to do this. You will. That contrast is devastating. They filed the challenge on Thursday morning, 3 days after the patent application became public record. The complaint was 37 pages of legal argument supported by 200 pages of exhibits, everything organized with the precision of people who knew they were about to detonate a bomb in the middle of a federal procurement process. United States Patent and Trademark Office, Alexandria, Virginia. Complaint. Patent application 12-247-893 filed with fraudulent inventor attribution. Complainant, Elijah Monroe, former chief engineer, Meridian Aviation Systems. Respondents, Vivian Ashford, CEO, Meridian Aviation Systems. Grayson Pemberton, board advisor. Allegation, false inventors listed. True inventor, Elijah Monroe. Request, independent technical review and examination of submitted evidence. The notification arrived via email to Vivian's office at 7 in the morning on Friday. Subject, USPTO Patent Challenge. Her coffee went cold in the Hermes mug that Eli had given her for their 2nd anniversary, back when gifts still meant something. Adrienne arrived within the hour, her expression tight with the controlled panic that lawyers felt when their clients were accused of federal crimes. He's bluffing. Vivian stared at her computer screen, reading the complaint summary that outlined Eli's evidence. Is he? Look at this list. 9 notebooks, video documentation, test reports, financial records. He documented everything. Those are company property. He had no right to remove them. Did we ever formally confiscate them? Did you include them in the asset division during the divorce? Adrian's silence answered the question. Grayson joined them via video conference from his Greenwich office, his face filling the monitor with an expression of annoyed confidence. Let him file his complaint. The Air Force won't delay a $4 billion contract because some engineer is bitter about his divorce. We'll present our case, they'll approve, and Monroe can spend the next 5 years in litigation if he wants. By then, we'll have the contract locked and the revenue stream established. Vivian's hands were shaking. A tremor she couldn't quite control. She clasped them together on her desk, trying to project the authority that had carried her through a decade of corporate warfare. What if they believe him? They won't. I'll make sure of it. The USPTO technical review was scheduled for the following Thursday at 9 in the morning, giving both sides 11 days to prepare. The examiner assigned to the case was Dr. Patricia Freeman, a 65-year-old former aerospace engineer who had spent 30 years at NASA before joining the patent office. Her reputation for thoroughness was legendary, and her intolerance for fraud was absolute. Vivian spent the next 10 days preparing like her life depended on it, because it did. PowerPoint slides were polished to perfection. Technical specifications were organized into binders weighing 5 pounds each. Grayson rehearsed his talking points, crafting a narrative about how military operational requirements had informed design decisions, how strategic vision had guided technical development. What Vivian hadn't prepared for was Eli filing a formal complaint with the Air Force Contracting Office simultaneously with the USPTO challenge. The second notification arrived on Wednesday, the day before the review. Department of Defense, Defense Contract Management Agency. Subject, Patent Fraud Investigation. Contract number FA8624-24-C-0001 Eclipse Propulsion System Procurement. The procurement officer assigned to investigate was a lieutenant colonel named Sarah Vance, a woman who had flown combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan and who took a dim view of contractors who lied about who actually designed the equipment her fellow pilots depended on. She would attend the USPTO review as an observer, with authority to suspend the contract pending investigation results. Vivian read the notification 3 times, her vision blurring at the edges. He's trying to kill the contract. Adrian closed her laptop with more force than necessary. He's not trying. If Freeman rules against us and Vance suspends procurement, the contract is dead. The Air Force will reopen bidding. Meridian loses $4 billion in revenue and our reputation gets destroyed. Stock price collapses. The board will remove you as CEO within 72 hours. So we make sure Freeman doesn't rule against us. How? Eli has video of himself deriving the core equations. He has notebooks dating back 4 years showing iterative development. He has test reports with his signature as principal investigator. What do we have? Vivian thought about the board presentations she'd given, about the investor calls where she'd explained Eclipse as though she understood it, about the Air Force procurement meetings where she'd spoken confidently about specifications that Eli had spent years developing. We have me. I'm the CEO. I directed the program. I secured the funding. That has to count for something. It counts as program management. It doesn't count as invention. Those are 2 different things under patent law, Vivian. You managed the project. He invented the engine. Those facts are going to matter tomorrow. That evening, Vivian sat alone in her office long after everyone else had left. The city lights of Dayton spread out below her window, and somewhere in that grid of streets and buildings, Eli was probably sleeping peacefully, knowing he had built a case strong enough to destroy her. She pulled up her contacts and scrolled to a name she had hoped never to use. Kyle Martinez, private investigator, corporate intelligence specialist, the kind of man who found things people wanted to stay hidden. She typed a message. Need to discuss urgent matter. Reputation management. Tomorrow before USPTO hearing. Premium rates accepted. The response came 30 seconds later. Too late for USPTO hearing. But I can help with other aspects. Call me after the hearing. We'll discuss options. Vivian deleted the message thread and poured herself scotch from the bottle she kept in her desk drawer. The glass was empty within minutes. She poured another. Across town, Eli sat at his kitchen table reviewing the evidence one final time with Tobias. They had worked until midnight organizing exhibits, preparing responses to likely questions, rehearsing the technical presentation that would demonstrate beyond doubt who actually invented Eclipse. Tobias closed the final binder and leaned back in his chair. You ready for tomorrow? I've been ready since November when I heard her planning to steal it. They're going to attack your credibility, question your motives, suggest you're a disgruntled employee making false accusations. How are you going to handle that? Eli thought about the video footage of himself working alone at 2 in the morning, filling whiteboards with mathematics while everyone else was home sleeping. He thought about the 9 notebooks written in his handwriting, signed and dated, witnessed by colleagues who could testify under oath. He thought about 4 years of his life reduced to evidence in boxes, but evidence so overwhelming that no reasonable examiner could ignore it. I'm going to show them the math. The math doesn't lie. The math doesn't have emotions or motivations, it just is. Either they can explain how Eclipse works or they can't. I can, they can't. That's the whole case. Zara emerged from her bedroom, 17 years old and unable to sleep because tomorrow her father was going to war with people who had more money, more power, more everything except the truth. Dad, what happens if you lose? Eli looked at his daughter, seeing Rebecca in her eyes and her stubborn chin. Then I lose. But I won't lose because I'm right. Not morally right, though I am. Mathematically right, technically right. The kind of right that survives in federal court because judges and patent examiners care about evidence, not feelings. What happens to Vivian if you win? She loses her reputation, probably her job. The patent gets reissued with my name. Meridian might face sanctions for filing fraudulent paperwork. That's not my problem. My problem is making sure the people who actually do the work get credit for doing it. He stood and pulled Zara into a hug, feeling her tension gradually ease. Go to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, but it's going to end the way it should, with the truth mattering more than money. The USPTO satellite office in Dayton occupied the third floor of a federal building downtown, a space designed for efficiency rather than intimidation. Conference Room C was beige walls and fluorescent lights, a table large enough to seat 20. The patent examiner sat at one end, flanked by technical advisors and legal counsel. Lieutenant Colonel Vance occupied a chair along the wall, present as an observer but radiating authority that made everyone acutely aware she could suspend a $4 billion contract with a single phone call. Vivian arrived at 8:45, accompanied by Adrian and Grayson. They carried matching leather portfolios and projected the confidence of people who believed preparation could overcome inconvenient facts. Vivian wore a navy Armani suit that cost $4,000. Her hair styled in a way that looked effortless but had required 90 minutes that morning. Eli arrived at 8:50, accompanied by Tobias. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt, pressed but not expensive. He carried a single banker's box containing copies of the key evidence, everything else already submitted to the examiner for review. Zara sat in the back row, her MIT acceptance letter folded in her pocket like a talisman. Doctor. Freeman looked up from her notes as everyone settled into their seats. Let's begin. This is a technical review of patent application 12-247-893, Eclipse Propulsion System. Listed inventors Vivian Ashford and Grayson Pemberton. Challenger Elijah Monroe alleges fraudulent inventor attribution. Both parties will present technical evidence. Questions will follow. Ms. Ashford, you may proceed. Vivian stood and triggered her first slide, a high-definition cutaway of Eclipse that made the engine look like sculpture. She had rehearsed this presentation 40 times over the past 10 days, refining every word, every pause, every gesture designed to convey expertise she didn't actually possess. Distinguished panel, the Eclipse propulsion system represents a quantum leap in military aviation technology. Mr. Pemberton and I have spent the last 4 years developing a turbofan engine that achieves unprecedented efficiency, reduced weight, and near-silent operation. She clicked to performance specifications. Compared to current generation engines, Eclipse delivered 18% weight reduction, 30% improvement in fuel efficiency, and 52% reduction in acoustic signature. These improvements translated directly to operational capability. Longer range, higher payload capacity, reduced detectability in contested environments. One of the technical advisors raised his hand. Ms. Ashford, can you explain how you achieved the blade geometry optimization? That's typically the most challenging aspect of turbofan design. Vivian's answer was textbook perfect because it was literally from a textbook, concepts Eli had explained to her in meetings she had recorded for training purposes. We used computational fluid dynamics modeling to identify optimal blade angles, then validated through wind tunnel testing and full-scale prototype evaluation. The key insight was recognizing that traditional symmetrical blade designs create unnecessary vortex formation at high RPM. By introducing asymmetry at the trailing edge, we delayed vortex onset beyond operational parameters. The advisor nodded, seemingly satisfied. Grayson added his piece, talking about operational requirements and mission profiles, painting a picture of how military experience had informed engineering decisions. It was convincing, the kind of narrative that procurement officers loved because it connected technology to tactics. Vivian finished with a flourish, confident that she had sealed the approval. "Thank you for your time. We're ready to answer any technical questions you might have." Dr. Freeman made a note, then looked at Eli. "Mr. Monroe, you have the floor." Eli stood slowly, his movements economical. He didn't have slides, he didn't have a rehearsed script. He had 9 notebooks, 300 hours of video, and a voice that carried the weight of 20 years in hangars where precision was the difference between life and death. "Dr. Freeman, ma'am, my name is Elijah Monroe. I worked at Meridian Aviation for 12 years. I designed the Eclipse propulsion system, not co-designed. Designed. Every equation, every test iteration, every refinement. It's my work." Vivian was on her feet before he finished the sentence. "That's a lie. He's a disgruntled ex-employee trying to sabotage—" Dr. Freeman's voice cut through the room like a blade honed on federal authority. "Ms. Ashford, sit down. Mr. Monroe, your evidence." Eli opened the banker's box and pulled out the first notebook, a composition book with a black and white cover that had been filled during late nights in 2020. The handwriting was his, cramped and precise, covering pages with calculations and sketches that showed Eclipse evolving from first principles. "This is volume 1 of 9. Each notebook is dated and time-stamped. Together they document every stage of Eclipse development from initial concept through final specifications." He produced test reports next, a stack 3 inches thick. 147 prototype test reports, every one signed by me as principal investigator, none signed by Ms. Ashford or Mr. Pemberton. The USB drive came last, slid across the table to the technical advisor who had asked about blade geometry. "This drive contains 300 hours of video showing me working alone on Eclipse calculations. It includes footage Ms. Ashford recorded for training materials. The timestamp metadata proves these videos were captured throughout the development timeline." The advisor plugged the drive into his laptop. The room went silent as video loaded, then filled with Eli's voice explaining the blade asymmetry concept, the same material Vivian had just presented as her own insight. The timestamp in the corner read 6 months before the patent filing. The video showed Eli at a whiteboard deriving equations that governed airflow across modified blades. His voice patient and pedagogical. The key to Eclipse was understanding that vortex formation isn't purely a function of blade speed. It's an interaction between geometry and boundary layer separation. If you modify the trailing edge angle to 46.8 degrees, you create a pressure gradient that keeps the boundary layer attached at higher RPM. Traditional designs use 45 degrees, which causes vortex formation at 18,000 RPM. At 46.8, vortex onset delays until 22,000, which is beyond our operational range. The engine never encounters that condition in normal flight. Vivian's voice came from off-camera, tinged with admiration that sounded genuine because it had been once. "This is brilliant, Elijah. You're absolutely brilliant." The timestamp was March 2023. The patent filing was September 2024. 18 months later. Grayson appeared nowhere in the 300-hour archive. Dr. Freeman paused the playback and looked at Vivian. "Miss Ashford, can you explain equation 52 in your patent application? The one governing pressure distribution across the asymmetric blade profile." Vivian's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Words formed but died before reaching sound. "It's a fluid dynamics equation. The specific derivation is, can you derive it? Now, at the whiteboard? I have engineers for that level of technical detail, but you're listed as the inventor. Inventors understand their own inventions. Either you can explain the core mathematical principle that makes Eclipse function, or you can't. Can you? The silence that followed was absolute. Vivian stood frozen, her carefully constructed presentation crumbling under the weight of a question she couldn't answer. Doctor. Freeman turned to Eli. Mr. Monroe, same question. Equation 52. Derive it. Eli walked to the whiteboard mounted on the conference room wall and picked up a dry erase marker. The cap came off with a soft pop that sounded loud in the absolute silence. His hand moved across the board, steady and unhesitating, building the equation line by line while everyone in the room watched a man prove ownership through pure mathematics. Pressure distribution across an asymmetric blade is a function of three variables: blade angle theta, rotational velocity omega, and fluid density rho. You start with the Navier-Stokes equation for incompressible flow. The first line appeared elegant in its complexity. Then you introduce the boundary condition that velocity must equal zero at the blade surface. That's basic fluid dynamics, but the challenge is modeling what happens when the blade isn't symmetrical. More lines filled the board, each one flowing naturally from the previous. Eli's voice remained calm, professorial, the tone of someone who had taught this material to junior engineers 100 times. The asymmetry creates a pressure gradient that works in our favor if you get the angle exactly right. Too shallow and you lose efficiency. Too steep and you induce turbulence that destroys the engine at high RPM. The sweet spot is 46.8 degrees, not 45, not 47, 46.8. He wrote for 5 minutes, deriving the equation from first principles, showing how the 46.8-degree angle emerged naturally from the mathematics when you optimized for minimal vortex formation. The board filled with symbols and numbers that told a story only engineers could read, but the story was clear. This was not memorized material. This was deep understanding, the kind that came from years of iteration and refinement. This is why the blade angle is 46.8 degrees and not some other value. At 45 degrees, vortex formation occurs at 18,000 RPM. At 46.8, vortex onset delays until 22,000, which exceeds our maximum operational parameters. The engine never encounters that condition in normal flight, which means no vortex, no efficiency loss, no catastrophic failure. Eli set down the marker and turned to face Dr. Freeman. I've derived this equation 712 times over the past 4 years. Every iteration, every refinement, every test that failed taught me something that led to this final version. It's mine because I built it, not because I managed people who built it, because I did the work. The room held its breath. Lieutenant Colonel Vance leaned forward in her observer chair, her expression unreadable but her focus absolute. Dr. Freeman made notes on her legal pad, then looked at Grayson. Mr. Pemberton, can you explain any aspect of this equation? Any contribution you made to the development of this mathematical model? Grayson's confidence had evaporated somewhere between Eli's first line and his last. He shifted in his chair, straightening his tie in the way people did when they needed time to formulate a response that wouldn't immediately sound like a lie. My contribution was strategic. I provided operational context that informed design priorities. Acoustic signature requirements, for example, came directly from special operations mission profiles I helped identify. So you provided requirements. You didn't develop the solution to meet those requirements. Well, in a collaborative environment, the distinction between it's a yes or no question, Mr. Pemberton. Did you perform any of the mathematical analysis, computational modeling, or testing that resulted in this engine design? The silence stretched long enough that even Grayson understood his next words would be recorded in federal documents that could later be used against him. No, I did not personally perform technical analysis. Dr. Freeman turned to Vivian. Miss Ashford, same question. Did you personally perform mathematical analysis, computational modeling, or testing? Vivian's hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She had spent 10 days preparing for this moment, rehearsing technical explanations, memorizing specifications, crafting a narrative that would survive scrutiny. But there was no narrative that could survive being asked to derive mathematics she had never understood. I directed the program. I made strategic decisions about resource allocation, timeline, testing priorities. I secured funding and negotiated contracts. In a corporate environment, invention happens collaboratively. The CEO provides vision and resources. The engineers execute that vision. We're both inventors under the legal framework of, can you derive equation 52? No, but invention isn't only about, thank you. That's all I need. Dr. Freeman closed her notebook and looked at the technical advisors flanking her. They nodded in silent agreement, a wordless communication that happened between experts who had seen enough. This hearing is concluded. Patent application 12-247-893 is flagged for fraud investigation by the USPTO Office of Enrollment and Discipline. The application is suspended pending resolution of inventor attribution. If investigation confirms fraudulent filing, the application will be invalidated and the parties responsible may face civil penalties and criminal referral. She turned to Lieutenant Colonel Vance. Colonel, the Defense Contract Management Agency will receive our preliminary findings within 48 hours. This panel cannot advise on procurement decisions, but we note that the listed inventors on the patent application appear unable to demonstrate basic understanding of the technology they claim to have invented. Vance stood, her Air Force uniform crisp in a room that suddenly felt too small for the consequences being distributed. Noted, Dr. Freeman. I'm suspending contract FA 8624-24-C-0001 pending completion of the USPTO investigation and a separate DoD review of contractor integrity. Meridian Aviation will not receive any contract payments and no production work will commence until this matter is resolved. Vivian's legs gave out and she sat down hard, the chair rolling backward from the force. $4 billion in revenue suspended. The contract that was supposed to carry Meridian for the next decade frozen. Her reputation destroyed in front of federal officials and her own attorney. Adrienne gathered documents with shaking hands, already calculating how many billable hours it would take to unwind this disaster, and knowing that no amount of legal maneuvering could change what had just happened. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was damning. The video footage showed Eli working alone while Vivian claimed credit. There was no defense because there was no truth in their position. Grayson disconnected from the video conference without a word, his face disappearing from the monitor as though he could escape consequences by simply logging off. Within 6 hours, he would resign from Meridian's board via email. Within 24 hours, his attorneys would be negotiating immunity deals with federal prosecutors, offering testimony against Vivian in exchange for reduced exposure to fraud charges. Eli packed his banker's box methodically, placing notebooks and USB drives back in their organized positions. Tobias stood beside him, both men maintaining the professional composure that concealed the magnitude of what they had just accomplished. Zara waited in the hallway, having watched through the window as her father dismantled a CEO and a board member using nothing but mathematics and truth. When Eli emerged, she threw her arms around him and held on with the desperation of someone who had spent 3 weeks believing her future was slipping away. "You did it. Dad, you actually did it." Eli's voice was quiet, meant only for her. "I just showed them what was already true. The work speaks for itself when you let it." They walked out of the federal building into afternoon sunlight that felt warmer than it should for late September. The F-150 was parked 3 blocks away, rust and all, waiting to carry them home to an apartment that was still too small and furniture that was still second-hand. But the MIT letter in Zara's pocket suddenly felt possible again. Like maybe dreams didn't have to die just because people tried to steal them. Vivian remained in the conference room for 15 minutes after everyone else left, staring at the whiteboard where Eli's equations were still visible, proof of expertise she had claimed but never possessed. Adrienne tried to offer strategic guidance about next steps, about damage control, about how they might salvage something from the wreckage. But there was nothing to salvage. Vivian had filed a patent with her name on work she couldn't explain. She had testified under oath that she was an inventor, then demonstrated she couldn't answer basic questions about her own alleged invention. Federal investigators would examine every document, every email, every recorded conversation. They would find the truth because Eli had documented everything. The drive back to Meridian headquarters took 20 minutes. Vivian made it in silence, Adrienne beside her reviewing notes that no longer mattered. The building looked the same from outside, 87 acres of manufacturing capability and engineering excellence that Vivian had believed was hers to control. She understood now that control was always an illusion. Real power came from building things that worked, from understanding how they worked, from being able to explain under oath exactly what made them function. She had none of that. She had only the appearance of expertise, a costume she wore convincingly until someone asked her to prove it. The board meeting was scheduled for 4 o'clock, an emergency session called by the chairman within an hour of Dr. Freeman's ruling. 14 members assembled in the executive conference room, their faces carrying expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed satisfaction. Vivian had made enemies during her tenure, executives she had pushed out, old guard she had dismissed as obsolete. They were about to have their revenge. The chairman, a 72-year-old named Douglas Winters who had served on the board since Vivian's father founded the company, opened the meeting without preamble. The USPTO has suspended our Eclipse patent application. The Air Force has suspended our $4 billion contract. Federal investigators are examining whether we committed fraud. Does anyone have an explanation for how we arrived at this situation? Silence filled the room. Grayson's empty chair spoke volumes about accountability and cowardice. Vivian sat at the head of the table, the CEO position that suddenly felt like a target rather than a throne. We relied on legal counsel's advice regarding inventor attribution. The patent application was filed in good faith based on collaborative development principles. Mr. Monroe's challenge is supported by 9 notebooks of calculations, 300 hours of video footage showing him working alone, and his ability to derive complex equations from memory while you couldn't explain basic principles of your own alleged invention. Douglas leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades in aerospace engineering before he moved to corporate governance. Vivian, I've known you since you were a child. I watched you grow this company and I respected your vision. But what happened today was not a misunderstanding about collaborative invention. It was fraud. You put your name on work you didn't do, work you don't understand, work that belongs to someone else. I directed the program. I secured funding. You managed. Management is not invention. Every engineer in this building understands that distinction. Apparently you don't, and that ignorance or arrogance or whatever motivated you to file that patent has destroyed $4 billion in contracts and exposed this company to federal prosecution. Another board member, a woman named Susan Chen who ran operations, added her assessment. The Eclipse contract represented 38% of our projected revenue for the next 5 years. Without it, we can't meet our obligations to existing contracts. We'll have to lay off 150 people by year-end. Stock price is down 18% since the market heard about the suspension. Our institutional investors are demanding accountability. Douglas called for a vote. All in favor of removing Vivian Ashford as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, raise your hand. 13 hands went up. Only Vivian's stayed down. Motion carries. Ms. Ashford, you're terminated for cause. You have 1 hour to clear your personal belongings from this building. Your access credentials will be deactivated at 5 o'clock. Adrian, please ensure she complies. The meeting continued without her, the board moving on to damage control and interim leadership as though she had already ceased to exist. Richard Torres, the Vice President of Operations, was appointed acting CEO with a mandate to cooperate fully with federal investigators and attempt to salvage the Air Force relationship by offering full transparency and corrective action. Vivian walked to her office in a daze, Adrienne trailing behind, offering words that sounded like comfort but carried no real substance. How do you comfort someone who had destroyed their own career through arrogance and theft? What words existed for that particular flavor of self-inflicted catastrophe? The office that had been hers for 5 years looked suddenly foreign, as though she was seeing it for the first time. The view of the hangars where Eli had spent 12 years building engines that actually worked. The desk where she had signed documents claiming credit for work she hadn't done. The credenza holding awards and recognitions for engineering excellence she had never actually demonstrated. All of it was costume and performance, impressive until someone asked her to prove it. She packed personal items into a cardboard box that had previously held printer paper. Photographs of her father, back when he ran Meridian with integrity instead of ambition. A crystal award from the Aerospace Industry Association that now felt like evidence of fraud. The Hermes mug that Eli had given her, which she left on the desk because accepting gifts from people you betrayed seemed like crossing a line that mattered even now. Security escorted her out at 5 o'clock exactly, walking beside her through corridors where employees stopped working to watch their former CEO being removed from the building. No one looked sympathetic. Most looked satisfied, particularly the engineers who had watched Eli get erased from presentations while Vivian took credit. Justice had a particular feel in corporate environments. It was quiet and procedural and absolutely merciless. The house she had thought was hers loomed large as she pulled into the driveway, a colonial-style structure worth $2.3 million in a neighborhood where tech executives and doctors lived. She had believed this house was her asset, secured in the divorce, protected by the prenup that made everything belong to her. Eli had lived here with her for 5 years, cooking dinner most nights because she worked late, maintaining the yard because she hired landscapers who never showed up on time, being invisible in the way husbands sometimes were when their wives decided they had become inconvenient. She unlocked the front door and stepped into silence that felt different than it had that morning. The furniture looked the same, the art on the walls hadn't moved, but something fundamental had shifted, as though the house itself knew she didn't belong here anymore. The doorbell rang at 6:30. Vivian wasn't expecting visitors, and for a moment she considered not answering. But ignoring problems had never worked before, and it certainly wasn't going to work now. Raymond Kowalski stood on the porch wearing a suit that marked him as someone official despite his age suggesting retirement should have come years ago. He held a manila envelope in an expression that conveyed both professionalism and a hint of personal satisfaction. Ms. Ashford? Yes. I'm here on behalf of Redtail Holdings, LLC to serve notice of eviction. You have 72 hours to vacate these premises. Vivian's hand tightened on the doorframe. This is my house. The divorce settlement. This house is owned by a trust established 8 years ago, 6 years before your marriage to Elijah Monroe. The trust beneficiary is Mr. Monroe. The property was never marital, which means the divorce settlement didn't convey ownership to you. You've been living here by permission, and that permission is now revoked. He handed her the envelope, which contained legal documents that looked official enough to be real and detailed enough to be enforceable. 72 hours, Ms. Ashford. If you're not out by Thursday at 6 p.m., the sheriff will escort you out and place your belongings on the curb. I'd recommend you start packing. Tobias Langford emerged from a car parked at the curb, walking up the driveway with the measured pace of an attorney who was delivering consequences rather than threats. Ms. Ashford, I'm Tobias Langford, Mr. Monroe's attorney. I'm also here to inform you that the Securities and Exchange Commission will be contacting you regarding Mr. Grayson Pemberton's trading activity. Mr. Monroe provided evidence suggesting Mr. Pemberton used non-public information about Eclipse test failures to short competitor stocks. The SEC takes insider trading seriously, particularly when it involves defense contractors. Vivian's voice came out smaller than she intended. Grayson's trading has nothing to do with me. Text messages between you and Mr. Pemberton discussing Eclipse testing timelines suggest otherwise. You provided him information that he used to profit from market movements. That makes you potentially liable as a tipper in an insider trading scheme. The SEC will explain your exposure when they contact you. I expect that will happen within 48 hours. He handed her a second envelope, thicker than the first. This contains copies of the communications we provided to federal investigators. You should retain counsel immediately. I'd recommend someone who specializes in white-collar criminal defense rather than corporate law, because the penalties for patent fraud and insider trading include prison time, not just fines. Tobias walked back to his car and Raymond followed, leaving Vivian standing in the doorway of a house that wasn't hers, holding documents that outlined the systematic destruction of everything she had built through a decade of ambition and 5 years of marriage. The evening news cycle picked up the story by 8 o'clock. Local stations ran segments about the Meridian Aviation contract suspension, featuring stock footage of aircraft and interviews with aerospace analysts who explained that patent fraud accusations were rare but devastating. National outlets covered it as part of broader defense procurement reporting, noting that a $4 billion contract had been frozen because the contractor couldn't prove their CEO actually invented the technology she claimed to have developed. Eli's name appeared in every story, described as a 12-year veteran engineer who had challenged the patent and proven his case through overwhelming documentation. Video clips from the USPTO hearing circulated online, showing him deriving equations on a whiteboard while Vivian sat silent, unable to explain her own alleged invention. The comment sections were brutal. Engineers from across the aerospace industry weighed in, recognizing the mathematics Eli had displayed and praising his thoroughness. MBA holders and corporate executives were mocked for thinking management experience qualified as technical expertise. Vivian's career became a cautionary tale that would be referenced in business ethics courses for years to come. The doorbell rang again at 9:15. Vivian had spent the past 3 hours sitting in darkness, unable to turn on lights because that would require acknowledging she was still here, still functional, still processing the magnitude of her losses. She didn't answer. Whoever it was could come back tomorrow or never, or leave a message that she would ignore. But the knocking persisted, and eventually she opened the door to find a process server holding yet another envelope. Vivian Ashford? Yes. You've been served. The envelope contained a civil complaint filed in federal court by the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Ohio. United States of America versus Vivian Ashford and Grayson Pemberton. Charges: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, making false statements to federal officials, obstruction of government procurement processes. The complaint detailed how Vivian and Grayson had knowingly filed a patent application with false inventor information, how they had testified at the USPTO hearing with intent to deceive federal officials, how their actions had interfered with a multi-billion-dollar defense contract by misrepresenting the true source of the technology. Maximum penalties: 20 years imprisonment for wire fraud, 5 years for false statements, 10 years for obstruction. Fines up to $500,000 per count. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks from today. She was ordered to appear or face additional charges for failure to comply with federal court summons. Vivian closed the door and slid down the wall until she was sitting on the entryway floor, her back against expensive wallpaper that she had picked out 3 years ago when the house was being renovated. When she had believed this was her house, her life, her success story written in square footage and appreciation value. Eli had played her perfectly. He had signed the divorce papers without protest, making her believe he was broken and defeated. He had walked away from the USPTO hearing having proven fraud so comprehensively that federal prosecutors had enough evidence for criminal charges. He had orchestrated eviction and SEC investigations and criminal complaints, all while maintaining the appearance of simply defending his work. She had measured him by his clothes and his truck and his quiet demeanor, assuming silence meant weakness. That assumption had cost her everything. The house felt colder as night deepened. Vivian remained on the floor, unable to move, unable to process the velocity of her fall. CEO to terminated employee in one afternoon. Homeowner to eviction notice in one evening. Respected executive to federal defendant in one day. Somewhere in this city, Eli was probably sleeping soundly in his small apartment with second-hand furniture, secure in the knowledge that truth had proven stronger than money. That documentation had defeated deception. That patience had outlasted arrogance. He had won because he had never actually been fighting. He had simply been protecting what was his, letting Vivian and Grayson believe they had stolen it while he built an evidence file so comprehensive that their guilt was beyond dispute. The lesson was simple, but Vivian had learned it too late. Never mistake silence for surrender. Some people stay quiet because they're thinking, because they're planning, because they understand that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the smartest. Eli had known that truth for 20 years. Vivian was learning it now, in the ruins of a career she had destroyed through arrogance and the illusion that titles mattered more than competence. She had one more call to make before this day ended. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number for Kyle Martinez, the private investigator she had texted before the hearing. He answered on the second ring. "Ms. Ashford, I saw the news. I assume you want to discuss options for managing Mr. Monroe's evidence. Can you find something? Anything that discredits him, that questions his credibility, that gives me leverage? I can investigate, but based on what I'm seeing in the reporting, he documented everything. The man spent 8 months building a case that federal investigators are calling one of the most thorough evidence packages they've seen in a patent fraud case. If there was dirt to find, someone would have found it by now. Please try. I'll pay whatever it takes. My rate is $500 per day plus expenses. Figure 2 weeks minimum, that's $7,000, and I can't promise results. Do it." Kyle paused, and Vivian heard something in his silence that sounded like pity mixed with professional obligation. "Ms. Ashford, professional advice. You're facing federal charges. Spend your money on a criminal defense attorney, not on investigating a man who has already proven his case beyond any reasonable doubt. Going after him now just makes you look vengeful and desperate. I don't care how I look. I need leverage. You don't have leverage. You have exposure. The best thing you can do is cooperate with prosecutors, offer testimony if you have anything useful, and hope for a plea deal that keeps you out of prison. Investigating Monroe won't change the fact that you filed a fraudulent patent and lied to federal officials. Those are the facts, and no amount of dirt on him will erase them. Vivian hung up without responding. She sat in darkness for another hour, then finally climbed the stairs to the master bedroom that would cease being hers in 72 hours. The bed was king-sized and expensive, sheets with thread counts she had once believed mattered. She lay down fully clothed and stared at the ceiling, unable to cry because grief required some measure of injustice to fuel it. But there was no injustice here. She had stolen from someone who had trusted her. She had claimed credit for work she hadn't done. She had lied to federal officials under oath. The consequences were severe, but they were fair. That was somehow worse than if she had been wrongly accused. At least then she could have fought back with righteous anger. Instead, she could only lie in darkness and count the hours until she became homeless, unemployed, and federally indicted. All because she had believed that managing was the same as building, that titles mattered more than competence, that a quiet engineer in cheap clothes would never have the spine to fight back. Eli had taught her otherwise, and the lesson would cost her everything.